Was it the way she held the paintbrush? Or the quiet grace in her movements that first made him realize his gray world was about to change forever? The morning sun filtered through dusty Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the worn hardwood floor of Thomas Whitmore's living room. He sat in his leather armchair, the same one he'd occupied every morning for the past 6 years, staring at the same 4 walls that had slowly transformed from cream to a dull, lifeless beige. Time had done that. Time and loneliness. The paint was peeling near the ceiling corners, revealing layers of history beneath. Colors from decades past, from lives once lived here, from laughter that had long since faded into silence. Thomas was 73 years old, though some days he felt ancient, and other days he felt like the young man who'd bought this house 40 years ago with his wife Margaret. But Margaret was gone now, 6 years gone, and the house, like Thomas himself, had been slowly deteriorating ever since. His daughter Claire had noticed during her last visit. She'd stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the cracked walls, the water stains, the way the afternoon light seemed to get swallowed by the drabness of it all. "Dad," she'd said softly, "this place needs some life breathed back into it." He'd nodded, said nothing. What was there to say? That painting the walls wouldn't bring Margaret back? That color couldn't fill the silence? But Claire was persistent. She'd arranged everything, made the calls, set the appointment. And on a Thursday morning in late September, when the air still held the warmth of summer but whispered promises of autumn, someone knocked on Thomas's door. He wasn't expecting anyone young. The painting company Claire had hired was called Restoration Hands, and Thomas had pictured a crew of middle-aged men with paint-splattered overalls and loud voices. Instead, when he opened the door, he found himself looking at a woman who couldn't have been more than 30, with eyes the color of sea glass and auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore white painter's pants and a faded blue t-shirt, and she carried a toolkit that looked well-used and well-loved. "Mr. Whitmore?" Her voice was steady, professional, but there was warmth there too. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I'll be handling your interior painting project." Thomas blinked. "Just you?" A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Just me. I do smaller residential jobs solo. Gives me more control over the quality." She extended her hand, and when Thomas shook it, he was surprised by the firmness of her grip, the confidence in it. He stepped aside to let her in, and watched as she entered his dim living room, her eyes immediately scanning the space with the practiced assessment of someone who saw beyond what was merely there. She walked to the center of the room, turning slowly, and Thomas found himself seeing his own home through her eyes, the faded wallpaper in the hallway, the scuffed baseboards, the way the light struggled to bring any warmth to the space. "When did you last paint?" she asked, running her fingers along the wall, feeling the texture. "My wife and I did it ourselves, about 15 years ago." Thomas's voice caught slightly on the word wife, a stumble he hoped Elena didn't notice. But she did notice. She glanced at him, and something in her expression softened. She didn't ask the obvious question, didn't offer the usual platitudes. She simply nodded and said, "Then it's definitely time." Over the next hour, they discussed colors, finishes, the scope of work. Elena pulled out sample cards, holding them up against different walls, explaining how certain colors would catch the light, how others would make the rooms feel larger or more intimate. Thomas found himself actually engaged in the conversation, something that surprised him. He'd expected to simply point at whatever Claire had suggested and be done with it. But Elena had a way of asking questions that made him think about what he actually wanted, not what he thought he should want. "What did this room feel like when you first moved in?" she asked at one point. The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him about feelings in a long time. It felt... He paused, searching for the right word. Possible. Like anything could happen here? Elena nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "Then let's bring that back." She started work the following Monday. Thomas had assumed he would retreat to his bedroom, or perhaps spend his days at the local library, staying out of her way. But something about the sound of her working, the gentle scrape of the paint scraper, the rhythmic roll of the brush against the wall, the occasional soft humming of a song he didn't recognize, kept him nearby. He'd set up in the kitchen with his crossword puzzles and his coffee, but found himself watching more than solving. Elena worked with a kind of meditative focus that was mesmerizing to observe. She didn't rush, but she didn't dawdle either. Every stroke seemed intentional, purposeful. She'd start each morning by carefully laying down drop cloths, taping edges with mathematical precision, preparing her workspace as if she were about to perform surgery rather than simply paint a room. And when she finally began applying color to the walls, it was like watching someone conduct a silent symphony. On the third day, during her lunch break, she sat at Thomas's kitchen table with a sandwich she'd brought from home. Thomas had made tea, something he hadn't done for a guest in years, and found himself sitting across from her. "You're very careful," he observed. "Most people would have been finished with this room by now." Elena took a sip of the tea he'd offered. "I don't paint houses, Mr. Whitmore. I restore them. There's a difference." She gestured toward the living room, where the first coat was drying on the walls, transforming them from that dead beige to a warm, soft gray that somehow made the room feel both larger and cozier. "A house holds memories. When I paint, I'm not covering them up. I'm giving them a new frame." It was perhaps the most profound thing anyone had said to Thomas in years. As the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. The house was changing, yes. The living room walls now glowed with that perfect gray. The hallway was becoming a soft cream that caught the morning light beautifully. But Thomas was changing too. He started making lunch for both of them. Then he began asking questions, not just about the painting, but about Elena herself. Where had she learned her craft? What brought her to this work? Her answers came slowly, shared in fragments between brushstrokes and color mixing. She'd studied art in college, but found she preferred the practical application of beauty over the conceptual. She'd apprenticed with her grandfather, a master painter in Mexico, who taught her that every space had a soul, and a painter's job was to help that soul sing. She was divorced, living alone, finding peace in the solitude of her work. There was something in the way she spoke about solitude that told Thomas she understood his silence not as emptiness, but as a language of its own. By the end of the second week, the transformation was remarkable. But Thomas noticed something else transforming too, something in the air between them, a quiet understanding that felt both comfortable and terrifying. He caught himself looking forward to her arrival each morning, found himself staying up later preparing questions to ask her the next day, discovered he was smiling more than he had in 6 years. And then one afternoon, as Elena stood on a ladder painting the crown molding in his bedroom, she said something that made his breath catch in his throat. "You know, Mr. Whitmore, a house is never really finished. It's always becoming something new." Thomas looked at her, at the way the afternoon light haloed her hair, at the focus in her eyes, at the paint-splattered hands that were bringing color back into his world, and realized she wasn't just talking about the house anymore. The words hung in the air between them like dust motes suspended in sunlight, and Thomas felt something shift inside his chest. A tectonic movement of emotion he'd thought was no longer possible. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Elena didn't seem to expect any. She simply returned to her work, her brush moving in smooth, deliberate strokes along the molding, and the moment passed. Or perhaps it didn't pass at all, but rather settled into the room like the fresh paint smell that now permeated every corner of the house. That evening, after Elena had left for the day, Thomas did something he hadn't done in 6 years. He went into the garage and retrieved the boxes he'd packed away after Margaret's funeral, the ones labeled Margaret's Things, in his daughter's handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the first box, revealing folded sweaters that still somehow held the ghost of her perfume, reading glasses she'd never needed but wore anyway, because she thought they made her look distinguished, a collection of recipe cards written in her looping handwriting. But it was the photo albums in the third box that made him sink onto the garage floor, his back against the cold concrete wall. He opened the first album, their honeymoon in Cape Cod, 1974. There she was, Margaret at 26, laughing at something off camera, her hair wild in the ocean wind, her smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the photograph itself. He turned the pages slowly. Their first Christmas in this house. The year they'd painted the living room a horrible shade of orange because Margaret insisted it would be cheerful, and they'd lived with it for 3 months before admitting defeat and repainting it cream. Claire as a baby, as a toddler, as a gap-toothed 7-year-old helping her mother plant tomatoes in the backyard. Thomas hadn't cried when Margaret died. The grief had been too large, too overwhelming to be expressed in something as simple as tears. But now, sitting in his garage with paint fumes drifting in from the house, and the scent of old photographs filling his lungs, he wept, not with the desperate anguish of fresh loss, but with something softer, more complex. He was crying for what he'd lost, yes, but also for what he'd forgotten, that this house, these walls, had once held so much joy that it seemed impossible they could ever feel empty. When he finally went back inside, the newly painted walls seemed different somehow. Not just cleaner or brighter, but more honest. As if Elena's careful work had revealed something fundamental that had been hiding beneath the years of neglect. The next morning, Elena arrived to find Thomas waiting with coffee already made and a plate of his wife's famous cinnamon rolls, baked from one of the recipe cards he'd found the night before. They were slightly lopsided and perhaps a bit too brown on the edges, but Elena's face lit up when she saw them. "Mr. Whitmore, you didn't have to do this." "Thomas," he said. "Please, just Thomas." Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken agreement that they were moving beyond the simple contractor-client relationship into something neither of them could quite name yet. Elena took a bite of the cinnamon roll and closed her eyes. "These are incredible. Where'd you learn to bake like this?" "I didn't. My wife did. I just followed her instructions." He paused, then added, "It's the first time I've used her recipes since she passed." Elena set down her coffee cup carefully, deliberately. "What was her name?" "Margaret." The name felt both painful and liberating to speak aloud. "She died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I'm sorry," Elena said, and unlike most people's condolences, which always felt like social obligations, hers felt genuine. 4 months isn't enough time to say goodbye. 6 years isn't either, apparently. They sat in silence for a while, and Thomas realized it was a comfortable silence. The kind he'd shared with Margaret on Sunday mornings when words weren't necessary, because presence was enough. "My grandfather used to say that grief is like old paint," Elena said finally. "You can cover it up with fresh coats, bright colors, but it's always there underneath. That's not a bad thing, though. Those layers are part of the house's history. They give it character, depth. The trick isn't to hide them, but to honor them while still letting new beauty emerge." Thomas looked at this woman who'd come to paint his house, and somehow ended up painting something inside him as well. "Your grandfather sounds like he was wise." "He was. He died when I was 23. I think that's partly why I do this work. Every house I paint feels like a conversation with him." Over the next few days, they began sharing more. Elena told him about her marriage, how it had crumbled not from any dramatic betrayal, but from the quiet erosion of two people who wanted different things from life. Her ex-husband had wanted certainty, predictability, a life mapped out in 5-year plans. Elena wanted to follow her grandfather's philosophy, that life was meant to be lived like painting, each day a fresh canvas where you responded to what was in front of you rather than following some predetermined design. Thomas told her about Margaret's final days, things he'd never told Claire because he didn't want to burden his daughter with the full weight of watching someone you love disappear by degrees. He told Elena about the morning Margaret couldn't remember his name, how she'd looked at him with confused eyes and called him the nice man with the kind face. He told her about the afternoon Margaret suddenly became lucid again and spent 3 hours telling him everything she wanted him to know. How to fix the dripping faucet in the bathroom, where she kept her favorite recipes, which of Claire's friends from childhood he should try to stay in touch with. Practical things, as if by filling his head with instruction she could somehow stay with him longer. "She never told me to move on," Thomas said one afternoon, as Elena painted the spare bedroom that had once been Claire's childhood room. "Everyone assumes dying people tell their partners to find happiness again, to not be alone. But Margaret never said that. I always wondered if it meant she wanted me to stay alone, to keep loving only her." Elena paused mid-stroke, considering. "Or maybe she trusted you to know what you needed. Maybe she knew you'd find your way to whatever came next without needing permission." The painting project was nearly finished. What was supposed to take 2 weeks had stretched into 3, then nearly 4. Elena worked slower than she probably should have, and Thomas found himself inventing reasons for her to stay longer. Maybe the trim needed a second coat. Perhaps the kitchen could use touching up too. They both knew what was happening. This unspoken reluctance to let the work end because ending the work meant ending these daily conversations, these shared lunches, this unexpected companionship that had bloomed like wildflowers in the cracks of their separate lonelinesses. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Elena finished the last room. Thomas stood in the doorway of his bedroom, looking at the transformed space. The walls were now a soft sage green that Margaret would have loved, the trim a crisp white that made everything feel clean and new. The afternoon light poured through the windows, and for the first time in 6 years, the house felt alive. "It's perfect," Thomas said quietly. Elena was packing up her supplies, wrapping brushes, sealing paint cans, the ritual of completion. "I'm glad you're happy with it." "I am. You've done remarkable work, Elena. Truly remarkable." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. They both knew this was goodbye. Tomorrow she would move on to her next project, another house that needed restoration, another client's walls to transform. And Thomas would be here, in his beautifully painted house, alone again. But somehow the solitude felt different now, less like a prison and more like a choice. "Before I go," Elena said, "I want to show you something." She led him back to the living room, to the wall behind where his leather chair sat. She'd been working there this morning before he'd woken up. "I know this wasn't part of the original plan, and if you hate it, I can paint over it. But I wanted to leave you with something." Thomas stepped around the chair and stopped. On the wall, so subtle it was almost hidden in the texture of the paint, Elena had created a small mural. It was abstract, nothing representational, just flowing shapes and colors that suggested movement, light, life. But worked into the design, in letters so delicate they seemed like whispers, were words. "A house is never really finished." His breath caught. He reached out to touch the wall, his fingers tracing the words he could barely see but somehow felt deeply. When he turned back to Elena, his eyes were wet. "I don't hate it," he managed to say. They stood there, two people who'd arrived at this moment from completely different directions, and Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to resurrect the past, but the quiet hope of someone realizing the future might hold unexpected grace. "Elena," he said, his voice stronger now. "Would you like to have dinner with me? Not tonight, since you probably have plans. But maybe this weekend?" She looked at him. Really looked at him. And Thomas saw his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. But also something else. Possibility. "I'd like that very much, Thomas." As she gathered the last of her things and walked toward the door, Thomas felt the weight of a decision forming, one he'd been avoiding for 6 years. He thought about Margaret, about the life they'd built in this house, about the grief he'd been wearing like old paint. And he thought about what Elena had said, that those layers gave a house character, that the trick was honoring them while letting new beauty emerge. "Elena, wait," he called out just as she reached the front door. She turned back, her hand on the doorknob, her expression open and curious. Thomas took a breath, steadying himself for what he was about to say, words that would change everything, words he'd been too afraid to even think until this woman came into his life with her paintbrushes and her wisdom, and her understanding of how things could be both broken and beautiful at the same time. Thomas stood frozen in his own hallway, his hand still extended as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. Elena remained at the door, her toolkit resting against her leg, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that some words needed time to be born. "I was going to ask you to stay for tea," Thomas said finally, the words softer than he'd intended. "But that's not really what I wanted to say." Elena set down her toolkit and took a step back into the house, closing the door gently behind her. The click of the latch echoed in the freshly painted hallway, and somehow that small sound felt monumental, as if they were sealing themselves into a moment that required privacy, protection from the outside world. "Then what did you want to say?" Thomas walked to the living room window, his back to her, watching the maple tree in his front yard shed its remaining leaves. How long had it been since he'd really looked at that tree? Margaret had planted it the year Claire was born. 37 years of growth, of seasons cycling through it, and he'd stopped seeing it somewhere along the way. "When Margaret was dying," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "she made me promise something. Not that I'd move on or find someone else. She never said those things. She made me promise that I wouldn't let the house die with her." He turned to face Elena now. "I broke that promise. I let everything fade, let the colors drain away. I think part of me believed that keeping things gray was a way of honoring her memory, as if brightness would be a betrayal." Elena moved closer, not touching him but present, her sea glass eyes reflecting the afternoon light filtering through his newly cleaned windows. "And now? Now I'm terrified." The admission came out raw, unvarnished. "Because you've painted my walls, and somehow that's made me realize I've been painting myself too, covering myself in layers of grief so thick I forgot there was anything underneath. And the worst part is, I'm starting to remember what it felt like to be alive, and that feels like the greatest betrayal of all." The silence that followed was dense with understanding. Elena sat down on his couch, the same couch where he and Margaret had watched countless movies, where they'd held Claire as a baby, where Margaret had napped during those final months when the cancer stole her energy, and patted the cushion beside her. Thomas sat, the springs creaking with familiar complaint. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" Elena asked. "The real reason my marriage ended?" Thomas nodded, grateful that she was offering her own vulnerability in exchange for his. "I was pregnant," Elena said, and Thomas felt the weight of that simple statement. 12 weeks along. We'd been trying for years, and when it finally happened, I thought it would fix everything that was broken between us. But it didn't fix anything. Instead, it showed us the truth, that we were two people who'd been performing a marriage rather than living one. She drew a breath, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I miscarried at 14 weeks, and instead of bringing us together, it pushed us apart completely. He wanted to try again immediately, as if a new baby could erase the loss. But I needed to grieve. I needed to sit with the pain instead of running from it." "I'm so sorry," Thomas said, and meant it with a depth that surprised him. "The thing is," Elena continued, "after the divorce, I spent 2 years painting houses 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. I thought if I stayed busy enough, if I transformed enough spaces, I could somehow transform myself, make myself new. But you can't paint over grief, Thomas. You can only learn to live with it in a way that doesn't diminish you." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the skilled painter who'd restored his home, but a woman who'd been quietly restoring herself, one wall at a time. Is that what you've been doing here? Learning to live with it? Maybe, she admitted. Or maybe I've been learning that it's okay to want something new without forgetting what came before. She turned to face him fully. When I paint a house, I always think about the people who'll live in it, what they'll feel when they wake up and see these walls, whether the colors I've chosen will bring them peace or energy or comfort. But this house, your house, I've been painting it like it was my own, like I had a stake in what happens within these walls. The admission hung between them, delicate as spun glass. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a sensation he'd almost forgotten was possible. He thought about Margaret, about the life they'd built, about the promise he'd made and broken, and he thought about what it might mean to keep that promise now, in a way he'd never anticipated. Claire calls me every Sunday, Thomas said, shifting gears so abruptly that Elena blinked. She lives in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids, 10 and 7. I haven't visited them in 4 years. They've invited me dozens of times, but I always find excuses. Too expensive, too far, too complicated to travel at my age. He laughed, a sound edged with self-recrimination. The truth is, I was afraid that if I left this house, if I went out and lived in the world, I'd somehow lose Margaret completely. As long as I stayed here, surrounded by her things, living in the spaces we'd shared, she was still real. And now? Elena asked gently. Now I think I've been confusing memory with presence. Margaret isn't in these walls, Elena. She's not in the boxes in the garage or the recipe cards in the kitchen. Those things are just artifacts. The real Margaret, the one I loved, she's in here. He tapped his chest. And she doesn't need gray walls to exist. Elena reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and solid and real. What are you saying, Thomas? He looked down at their joined hands, hers still stained with flecks of sage green paint from his bedroom walls, his marked with age spots and the fine tremor of 73 years of living. I'm saying that I'd like to have that dinner with you, and maybe more dinners after that. I'm saying that I'm terrified and exhilarated and guilty and hopeful all at once, and I have no idea if that means I'm ready for whatever this is between us. But I know I don't want it to end with you walking out that door. Elena's eyes glistened, and Thomas couldn't tell if it was from joy or sorrow or some complex mixture of both. Thomas, I need you to understand something. I'm not Margaret. I can't be her, and I don't want to try to be her. If we do this, whatever this is, it has to be something completely new, not a replacement or a substitute, but its own thing entirely. I know, Thomas said, and realized he did know, perhaps had known all along. That's what scares me most, because loving Margaret was the easiest thing I ever did. We fit together like we'd been designed for each other. But this feels uncertain and risky, and nothing like what I had before. And somehow that feels right. They sat there on the couch, hands intertwined, as the afternoon light shifted and changed around them. Outside, the maple tree released another cascade of leaves, a slow-motion golden rain that caught the sunlight. Thomas watched them fall and thought about seasons, about how nothing stays the same, about how even trees that look dead in winter are just preparing for spring. I should tell you something else, Elena said after a long moment. About why I took this job in the first place. Thomas felt a small tremor of apprehension. Okay. Your daughter Claire contacted me directly. She didn't just hire a painting company. She found me specifically. We met for coffee before I ever came to your house. Elena's voice was steady but careful, as if she were walking on thin ice and testing each step. She told me about her mother, about how you'd been living since she died. She asked me to take my time with the job, to not rush, to maybe try to talk to you while I worked. She was worried about you, Thomas. She said you'd stopped living, that you'd become a ghost in your own house. The words should have felt like a betrayal, like manipulation. But instead, Thomas felt something else, a wave of love for his daughter so strong it almost knocked him breathless. Claire had known. She'd understood what he needed, even when he didn't understand it himself. And she'd found a way to help him without forcing him, without confrontation or ultimatums. "So this was all planned?" Thomas asked. But there was no accusation in his voice, only curiosity. The job was planned. Everything else... Elena gestured between them. "This was completely unplanned. I came here to paint your house and maybe coax you out of your shell a little bit. I didn't come here to feel what I'm feeling." "And what are you feeling?" Elena smiled, and it was the most genuine smile Thomas had seen on her face yet. "Like I came to paint your house and ended up painting myself into a corner I'm not sure I want to escape from." Thomas laughed, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest, and the sound filled the room like music. When was the last time he'd laughed like that? He couldn't remember. "Claire's clever," he said. "Too clever by half, just like her mother. She loves you very much." "I know. I should call her. Tell her the painting's done. Tell her..." He paused, considering. "Tell her I'm thinking about visiting Seattle for Christmas." Elena's face lit up. "Are you?" "Maybe. If I can convince a certain painter to come with me. As my guest, not as my contractor." The boldness of the invitation surprised them both. Elena opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Thomas, we've known each other for less than a month. Don't you think that's moving fast?" "I've moved slowly for 6 years," Thomas said. "I think I'm due for some speed." They talked until the light faded completely from the windows, and the newly painted walls glowed soft in the gathering dusk. They talked about fear and hope, about loss and possibility, about what it meant to honor the past while reaching for the future. And somewhere in that conversation, Thomas realized something that changed everything. He didn't need Elena to replace Margaret. He didn't need her to fill the void Margaret had left. What he needed was to be someone new, someone who could hold both his history and his future, without letting either one diminish the other. Elena wasn't brightening his world by erasing the darkness. She was teaching him that he could contain both light and shadow, joy and grief, memory and hope, all at once. When Elena finally stood to leave, the house felt different again. Not just because of the fresh paint, but because something fundamental had shifted in the air itself. "So," Elena said at the door, her toolkit in hand once more. "Dinner this weekend?" "Dinner this weekend," Thomas confirmed. She stepped out into the October night, and Thomas watched her walk to her van, watched her load her equipment, watched her drive away. But this time, he wasn't watching someone leave his life. He was watching someone who would return. He closed the door and stood in his transformed hallway, running his hand along the cream-colored walls that Elena had painted with such care. And for the first time in 6 years, Thomas Whitmore felt something that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He felt ready. The restaurant Elena chose was a small Italian place tucked into a neighborhood Thomas had driven past 1,000 times but never noticed. It had string lights draped across an outdoor patio, though the October chill had driven most diners inside. Thomas arrived early, nervous in a way he hadn't been since his first date with Margaret nearly 50 years ago. He wore a blazer he'd forgotten he owned, found pressed and waiting in the back of his closet, as if it had been patiently anticipating this moment. Elena arrived exactly on time, wearing a deep blue dress that made her eyes even more striking. She'd left her hair down, and it fell in soft waves around her shoulders. For a moment, standing in the doorway of the restaurant with the warm light behind her, she looked like something from a dream, and Thomas had to remind himself that this was real, that he was allowed to want this. Dinner unfolded like a conversation they'd been having all their lives. They talked about everything and nothing, books they'd loved, places they'd traveled or wanted to travel, the small observations about human nature that came from watching people carefully. Elena told him about learning to paint from her grandfather in Guadalajara during childhood summers, how he'd taught her that every color had a temperature, a mood, a a story to tell. Thomas told her about his career as a high school history teacher, how he'd loved showing teenagers that the past wasn't dead, but living, breathing, constantly influencing their present in ways they didn't recognize. "You and I are in similar businesses," Elena observed, twirling pasta onto her fork. "You taught people to see how the past shapes the present. I help people transform their spaces while honoring what came before. We're both in the business of perspective." Thomas considered this. "I never thought of it that way. But you're right. Margaret used to say that I didn't teach history. I taught people how to think about time." At the mention of Margaret's name, Elena didn't flinch or change the subject. Instead, she leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about her. Not about her dying, but about her living." So Thomas did. He told Elena about Margaret's terrible sense of direction, how she once got lost driving to a grocery store they'd been going to for 15 years. He told her about Margaret's insistence on naming all their appliances. The vacuum was Gerald, the washing machine was Beatrice, the ancient microwave was Sir Reginald. He told her about the way Margaret sang off-key in the shower, how she believed that dogs could understand complete sentences if you spoke to them respectfully, how she'd cried watching every Pixar movie ever made, even the bad ones. And as he talked, something remarkable happened. The memories didn't hurt the way they used to. They were still bittersweet, still tinged with loss, but they were also warm, full of light, celebratory rather than mournful. Elena listened with complete attention, laughing at the funny parts, her eyes soft during the tender moments. She wasn't intimidated by Margaret's memory. She was honoring it, making space for it at their table like an invisible guest whose presence was welcome. "She sounds wonderful," Elena said when Thomas finally wound down, like someone who understood that life is meant to be lived with joy, even in the small moments. She was. She did. Thomas paused, then added, "I think she would have liked you." "You think so?" "I know so. Margaret believed that people came into your life for reasons you couldn't always see at first. She'd say you came to paint my house, but really you came to remind me that walls aren't the only things that can be restored." After dinner, they walked through the neighborhood, past houses with lit windows and the sounds of families inside. Television laughter, dinner conversations, the ordinary symphony of people living their lives. Thomas found himself telling Elena about the decision he'd been avoiding. "I think I need to sell the house," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. Not because of bad memories, but because it's too big for one person. Too much house, too much yard, too much of everything. "I've been rattling around in there like the last marble in a jar." Elena slipped her arm through his as they walked, a gesture so natural it felt like they'd been doing it for years. "Where would you go?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere smaller. Maybe one of those condos near the river. Or maybe..." He hesitated. "Maybe somewhere completely new. Somewhere I've never lived before, where every room isn't filled with memories of what used to be." "That's brave," Elena said quietly. "It's terrifying," Thomas corrected. "But staying feels more terrifying now. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and Thomas marveled at how silence with Elena felt full rather than empty, companionable rather than lonely. When they reached her car, neither of them moved to say goodbye. "Thomas," Elena said, "I need to be honest about something. When I took your job, I told myself I was just helping a lonely man, that it was an act of kindness Claire was paying me to perform. But about 3 days in, I realized I was looking forward to seeing you. By the end of the first week, I was taking longer on purpose, finding excuses to stretch out the work. And by the time I painted that message on your wall, I knew I wasn't just painting your house anymore." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "What were you doing?" "Painting myself into your life. Hoping you'd notice. Hoping you'd want me there." He reached for her hand, held it gently. "I noticed. And I want you here." The kiss, when it came, was soft and tentative and sweet. Not the passionate fire of young love, but something deeper, more knowing. It was the kiss of two people who'd both lost things, who both carried scars, who both understood that loving again meant being brave enough to risk losing again. When they pulled apart, Elena's eyes were bright with tears. "What are we doing?" she whispered. "I think we're starting something," Thomas said. "I think we're being brave." The months that followed weren't perfect. There were moments when Thomas would wake in the middle of the night, disoriented, expecting to find Margaret beside him and feeling the loss all over again. There were times when Elena's independence clashed with Thomas's long-established routines, when they had to navigate the complicated terrain of two people learning to orbit each other after years of solitary paths. There were difficult conversations with Claire, who was thrilled that her father was dating but also protective, worried, still grieving her mother's loss, even as she wanted her father to find happiness. But there were also Sunday mornings cooking breakfast together, Elena teaching Thomas how to make proper huevos rancheros, while he taught her his secret for perfect pancakes. There were evenings spent reading side by side on Thomas's couch, their feet touching, comfortable in shared silence. There were trips to art galleries and hardware stores, long drives through autumn leaves, conversations that stretched until dawn about philosophy and mortality and what it meant to live a good life. Thomas did sell the house eventually. It was harder than he'd expected, boxing up 40 years of memories, deciding what to keep and what to let go. But Elena was there for all of it, helping him sort through the garage boxes, the attic treasures, the accumulated artifacts of a life well lived. Together they found homes for most of it. Claire took the photo albums and Margaret's jewelry, local charities took the furniture and clothes, and Thomas kept only what mattered most. His books, a few pieces of art, Margaret's recipe cards, and the small wooden box where she'd kept love letters he'd written her over the years. The new condo near the river was bright and modern, with large windows that let in floods of natural light. Elena helped him paint it, and this time Thomas worked alongside her, learning the meditative rhythm of the brush, understanding finally what she meant about restoration being a form of meditation. They painted the living room a soft yellow that caught the morning sun, the bedroom a calming blue-gray that made the space feel like a sanctuary. On moving day, as Thomas stood in his empty old house for the last time, he felt Margaret's presence more strongly than he had in years, not as a ghost, not as an ache, but as a whisper of gratitude. He walked through each room, touching walls that Elena had painted, remembering not just Margaret but everything, the full spectrum of his life, the joy and the sorrow, the love and the loss. And he understood finally that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant making room. Claire visited for Thanksgiving, bringing her family. She met Elena properly for the first time, and Thomas watched as his daughter and this woman who'd become so important to him sized each other up with careful politeness that gradually warmed into genuine affection. After dinner, Claire pulled Thomas aside. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something. When I hired Elena, I just wanted someone to fix up the house, so maybe you'd feel better about living there. I never imagined—" She gestured toward the living room where Elena was showing Claire's kids how to mix paint colors. "This. Are you okay with it?" Thomas asked, suddenly anxious. "With me and Elena?" Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, you've been gray for 6 years. Actually gray, like someone had drained all the color out of you. But now," she smiled, "now you look like yourself again. Like the dad I remember from before. Mom would be so happy to see you happy." "You think so?" "I know so. Mom's last words to me, before she couldn't talk anymore, were, 'Take care of your father, but don't let him take care of himself to death.' I think she knew you'd try to preserve everything exactly as it was, like a museum to her memory. But that's not what she wanted. She wanted you to live." That night, after Claire and her family had gone to their hotel, Thomas and Elena sat on his new balcony, watching the river reflect the city lights. Thomas thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the gray walls of a dying house to this bright new space, from crushing solitude to this comfortable companionship, from a man frozen in grief to someone brave enough to risk his heart again. "Do you ever wonder?" Thomas said quietly. "What would have happened if Claire hadn't hired you? If some other painter had come to my door?" Elena considered this. "I think about it sometimes, but I also think about what my grandfather used to say, that the right colors always find their way to the right walls. Maybe you and I were always going to find each other somehow. Maybe Claire just helped speed up the inevitable." "You really believe that? In fate or destiny or whatever you want to call it?" "I believe in readiness," Elena said. "I think opportunities come to us all the time, but we can only see them when we're ready. You were ready, Thomas. Maybe not when I first knocked on your door, but somewhere during those weeks of painting, you became ready. And that's what mattered." Thomas pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her presence. He thought about all the versions of himself he'd been. The young man who'd married Margaret, the father who'd raised Claire, the teacher who'd shaped young minds, the widower who'd nearly disappeared into grief. And now this. A man capable of loving again. Differently, but no less deeply. "I'm grateful," he said simply. "For you. For this. For second chances I didn't know I was allowed to want." "Me too," Elena whispered. They sat there as the night deepened around them. Two people who'd both known loss, who'd both survived it, who'd both been brave enough to risk opening their hearts again. The river flowed below them, constant and changing. The same water never passing twice, always moving forward while honoring where it had been. Thomas thought about his house, the one Elena had painted, the one he'd sold, the one that had held so much of his history. It would hold someone else's history now, would witness new loves and losses, new joys and sorrows. And somehow that felt right. Houses, like hearts, were meant to be lived in, not preserved like museums. They were meant to hold life in all its messy, beautiful, complicated glory. He thought about the question that had started all of this. Was it the way she held the paintbrush, or the quiet grace in her movements that first made him realize his gray world was about to change forever? And he realized now that it was neither and both. It wasn't any single moment, but the accumulation of them. Each brushstroke, each conversation, each shared silence that had painted him back into living color. Elena had come to paint his house. But in the end, she'd painted something far more important. She'd painted possibility. She'd painted hope. She'd painted proof that even in the deepest gray, color could emerge again if you were brave enough to let it. And sitting there on his balcony, Thomas Whitmore understood something profound. We are all houses, constantly being painted by time and experience and loss and love. Some of us get worn down, our colors fading until we forget what brightness looked like. But with the right person, at the right time, in the right moment of readiness, we can be restored. Not returned to what we were, but transformed into something new. Something that honors the past while embracing the future. Something that contains both shadow and light. Something beautifully, impossibly alive.